Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Friday morning, most of the way through what can be a very long conference. We were introduced up here with Tara, Brenda, and I, but I also want to acknowledge in the audience we have Stephanie, Kaarina, and Meredith, who also strongly contributed to this presentation. We were just trying to minimize the amount of distraction of switching people back and forth, so we only have 3 of us up here talking today. I also want to acknowledge that today we are on the Mi'kmaq territory, and to recognize our obligations and commitments to our treaty obligations as we gather here today on this unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Okay. So as we are starting here today, we're going to start with a moment of reflection. So think for a moment about, for you, what does professionalism mean? And does it include things like making the profession look good? So when we think about professionalism, historically, professionalism has roots in some of the ethical virtues that we bring with us to the profession. Some of these are listed here on the slide, including dependability, honesty, reliability, skill, integrity, capability, confidentiality, respect, responsibility, and trustworthiness. And these virtues are important because as professionals, we are put in a position of power where we have the expectation to be acting in the best interests of other people. We are often allowed to do things with consent that would otherwise be considered violations of human rights because we are thought to have these skills and underlying values that we bring with us. And so these values are important as professionals and what we're expected to enact as professionals. However, what professionalism also serves to do, on top of supporting some of these virtues, is to mark boundaries and secure the boundaries between in-groups and out-groups, creating a kind of social closure around members of the profession. And it does this by normalizing particular standards for bodies, standards for interactions, manners, decorum, appearance, language use, emotional expression, and comportment. And so what these ethical virtues that are supporting our profession, what happens is they become kind of operationalized into things that can be easily observed. And so these markers become markers of what a professional is representing these virtues, but don't necessarily have that match because these are not developed as necessarily manifestations of the same virtues that they promote. And so despite the claim that professional comportment is neutral, it is in fact the product of socialization into a particular culture, kind of a professional culture. And that culture is based on white, Anglo, heterosexual, middle-class men who are most socialized into the culture and representing the virtues in the ways, in these ways that are appearable in terms of language, bodies, interactions. And what happens is that those who may be outside of these norms need to suppress or squish themselves in ways to try and fit into these boundaries. And often that happens through terms like unprofessional. So being called unprofessional serves as a mechanism of social closure, disciplining people and behaviors that come from OTs from non-conforming dominant groups. So things that are outside kind of that cultural expectation of white, middle-class, heterosexual male become things that are labeled as unprofessional. And so today we're going to draw on the interviews from 20 occupational therapists across Canada who identify with at least one of racialized, ethnic minority, disabled, 2S LGBTQ+, working class or impoverished family backgrounds to see some of the ways that this professionalism is disciplining people into presenting themselves in particular ways that may not reflect what some of these virtues are. So some of the themes that we're going to be talking about today are professionalism being manifest in ways of conforming bodies, conforming speech and manners, conforming emotions, conforming appearances, and conforming boundaries. And also drawing on literature, looking at the last 30 years or so of literature around professionalism in OT, looking at how professionalism is often symbolic, some of the criteria that have been outlined of how to present oneself professionally, the control of professionalism and compulsory assimilation that occurs within the profession. So the first theme we have from the interviews is the theme of conforming bodies. So how people need to change or shape their bodies to be representative of what is expected as a professional. And so this is a quote from an occupational therapist saying, "I always felt that I look unprofessional if my hair was not straight. So I know for OSCEs and such, I spent quite a bit of time straightening my hair. I felt like I needed to dress up quite a bit." So we can see, this is from a racialized occupational therapist, how the kind of expectation of some of those white upper class markers of credibility come through in what the expectation is for performance on something like an OSCE. And from a disabled OT, we heard things like, it's one thing for a client to know I have a disability, but it's another to see the symptoms. I would be afraid if they would see them, they would shut down or think this person is not professional enough. So really trying to shape their body to make sure they're displaying it in a professional way. We also heard examples of how people will change their speech or manners, how they communicate in order to appear professional. So for example, we heard from an OT, my tone of voice and my intonation changes when I'm talking to someone at work versus someone I'm just comfortable with in my day-to-day. So that was another thing I had to shift and change, all my aspects of speech and nonverbals. So speech was expected to be conveyed in a particular professional way at work that was outside of what their typical way of communicating would be with other people who they were comfortable with.
Chris, if you can't hear me in the back, just like wave at me and do this. Okay. So Black OTs in particular were described having to tone down not just their speech and their presentation of self, but their emotions. When expressing anger, for example, one Black OT was told, calm down. I'm not allowed to express my feelings in a way that feels comfortable for me because they're getting uncomfortable. So I don't get to be myself when I'm in a room full of white people. I've got to bend myself in a pretzel to make sure that they don't feel uncomfortable. Queer and working class OTs in particular struggled with normative expectations around dress and appearance. For example, this queer OT said, I think I would dress more flamboyant if only, I don't think I've pushed the limit. I would wear bright clothing in my personal life, but I don't think I'd do it very much in my work. Definitely dress conservatively at work. Queer OTs and those whose ethnicities incorporated religion found boundary expectations silence them at work. For example, this therapist never disclosed her Jewish identity. You shouldn't be talking about your personal life in any capacity. I wouldn't be talking about my family. I wouldn't be talking about my friends. I wouldn't be talking about what I did that day. And I wouldn't be talking about my religion. So I would get away from that topic anyway. And then you're working in a professional capacity. And this is the part that I find really fun. So Meredith and I worked on 30 years worth of literature to look at the ink spilled about what professionalism means in OT. And we went through all of the literature on markers of professionalism, the expected behaviors and attitudes. And while there's a lot of focus on skills, which is important, and ethical virtues that Kaitlin talked about, they also emphasize what it means to look and act professional. There are rules here about appearance and dress, ways of interacting, lots of stuff about being appropriate, someone particular personality types, or being the quote, right kind of person. There's a lot of reliance here on terms like appropriate, proper, and that's where these normative standards and expectations sneak in. Here's a stellar example. This 2017 text defines professionalism as conforming to the standards and norms of a given profession, behaving in a manner defined and expected by the chosen profession. For example, there's a whole section on appearance and dress. One must conceal all tattoos, no more than 2 piercings in each ear, and have a professional hairstyle. She also helpfully defines unprofessional, which is very useful. Poor eye contact, closed body posturing, and overly warm handshake are among them. And in case any of that is unclear, she provides numerous photographs to show you what it should look like. So professionalism, this term, this is funny, but it's not silly. These norms, these notions of professionalism that are grounded in whiteness, Western politics of respectability, get used to demand conformity, and that pays a particular price for OTs and students who don't come from these dominant normative groups. Speaking from medicine, Mokachaney and colleagues say the Western notion of professionalism looks down on those who dare to be different or are different. They experience discrimination and frequent reminders that they must be obedient to Western notions of what it means to be a professional. The concept of professionalism is weaponized instead of being used to affirm one's identity. Marome, working with Indigenous teachers in Canada, talked about the term professional microaggressions to capture the ways that professionalism as term hides the policing of people, especially those from non-dominant groups, forcing compulsory assimilation and conformity with these normative expectations. In OT, beyond these appearances about appearing professional, people from marginalized groups are policed for just being what I call too much, too little. Too loud, too quiet, too angry, too emotional, too reserved, too sensitive, too radical, too accented, too casual, too flamboyant, too queer, too little eye contact, too much eye contact, too direct, too indirect, too fidgety, and too intense. I have heard every single one of these in my years in OT. And there are elements of making the profession look good in defining professionalism. OT employers in research said that you should be committed to representing the profession, department, and employer well with clients, in organization meetings, on social media, and out in the community. Faculty say you have a contract with your profession to never let your profession look bad. They also define unprofessional as including complaints or critiques about your peers, instructors, or the academic institution. There's something very troubling here about a profession being committed to avoiding critical self-reflexivity. It's a sign, in my opinion, of a very immature profession. I'm done. Sarah's turn. I got so excited. I just wanted to keep going.
Oh my gosh, that was awesome. Okay, so outside of occupational therapy, reflexive critiques of professionalism are actually quite normal and common, asking really how professionalism produces conformity. And the quote on the slide at the top here, but in 2021, talks about how professionalism has been hollowed out to a discourse of performity, disciplining and excluding some people and some bodies, and not just requiring mastery of knowledge and skills, but producing, like Brenda said, the right kind of self. And so in 1999, the quote at the, I don't have, goes up there, not good at clicking. There's an interesting twist in the criteria used to define and assess the competence of professional practitioners about conducting and constituting, can't say that word, oneself in an appropriate manner. So again, you hear the term appropriate a lot, but what does that actually mean? And so within OT, there have been calls for deconstructing the assimilationist concept of professionalism nonetheless. So in 2007, Hazel McKay argued the normalizing professional discourse produces docile bodies able to be molded, but also self-censoring and disciplining. And 14 years later, Pierre-Luc Turcotte and Dave Holmes, hi Pierre, have argued that occupational therapy as a profession requires its members to be obedient and submit to its sets of rules and norms in order to be included in the field. They argue virtue means to be like the rest and vice is to be different. In contrast, though, thanks, Brenda. In contrast, though, they welcome disagreement and debate, oppositional voices, calling on OTs to be disobedient, question authority and false consensus, and disrupt the status quo by becoming common sense rebels. You're going to hear me say this a lot. Every day, people who are listening to me present. In the Global South, OTs have long been clear that activism is very much not framed as compatible with professionalism. For example, in South Africa, Sonde and colleagues speak of professional role transgressions as a resistance to dominant structures in OT. And in Brazil, Garcia Ruiz and Malfitano write of resistance as the form of creating alternatives for other actions. So in Canada, though, activism has typically been defined very much as a counter to professionalism. But given the 2022 competencies, I think we need to be really clear here that activism is a part of professionalism, and it is in fact our responsibility. So how do we learn, teach, and practice disobedience and resistance? In the context of medical education, Tasha Wyatt and colleagues researched the complex calculations that go into every single act of resistance. If unjust hierarchies are upheld through repeated acts of deference and obedience, then they can be undermined by defiance and disobedience. They found that learners and professionals from non-dominant groups are skilled at resistance, identifying the line between pushing too hard and not pushing hard enough. So every act of resistance really requires thoughtful calculations of costs and benefits and existing power relations. Sometimes it means using positions, structures for credibility and safety, and identifying strategically the best approaches on how to enact resistance. So what would it mean for OT if we could no longer use the non-transparent term unprofessional as a way of policing ourselves and each other into conformity? How instead might we govern ourselves and each other? Would it be more transparent to say, I felt disrespected than you were unprofessional? We'll end with a vision from a recent editorial in the Colombian OT journal, Revista Ocupación Humana, that says, we are a professional community to the extent that we recognize the coexistence, plurality, and simultaneity of different knowledge and practices in our work.